We're going to be Luke chapter 16, if you want to turn your Bibles there or your phones or tablets, however you look at it. For those of you visiting with us, I'm James Coburn. I'm one of the elders. Cole Mueller has a day off, so he's our regular minister. So if you're visiting with us, and we encourage you to come back and see us any other time. There's one other thing I need to make mention before we get into our lesson also, and this is my fault. Please don't blame Pam for this. This is my fault. Prime Timers will not be meeting this month at the Annex. We will be meeting at Mary Nell Nance's house for January 8th. So I know it said on the screen that we would be meeting in the Annex, and that's normally where we do meet. But this time, January 8th, we're going to meet at her house. So if you're part of that Prime Timers, mark that on your calendar. That's where we will be meeting. The year was 1977 BC. 1977 BC, that means before children. That was the first time Julie and I, as a married couple, moved to Victoria. She had grown up here. We left the city on the hill. For those who don't know what that means Abilene. We left the city on the hill because both of us had finished our education. I was working at the time for Coca-Cola, seeing that was not going anywhere. So we decided to come back here, and I went back to school. And Julie came down and started her teaching career out at nursery. And when we came here the first time, we lived here for 11 years. And the ironic thing is Julie said she'd never move back home. Well, we were here for 11 years. But we worshiped over at college at that time. And if you want to know why, I'll just talk to me privately, and I'll fill you in on that one. But at the time when we were meeting over at college, they had a couple of elders, Dr. Jack Cogswell and Al Burden. And Al Burden, I had gotten to know, was one of the money managers for one of the wealthy families here in Victoria, and apparently had done it for quite some time and had a good reputation about it. In Luke chapter 16, we're introduced to a parable at the beginning of, and some older translations call it the unrighteous manager, some call it the shrewd manager, if you look at the new NIV. And it's a parable that Jesus tells not only to the Jewish leaders, as Jesus would oftentimes do, he would have a lesson for his disciples in a parable and a lesson for the Jewish leaders. And this was no exception. And when Jesus gets into this parable, and in fact, if we had time, we'd go through the whole book or the whole chapter 16, but we don't have time. But if you look at both those stories that Jesus tells, they have to do with how do people deal with wealth? How do they deal with money, basically? But in this first one, let's pick it up in Luke chapter 16, and we'll start with verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. Apparently, someone had gone to this master and told him, you know what, the manager that you've got that's managing your money, your wealth, he's mismanaging it. He's not doing it right. Now, we're not told who that was. We're not told if it was a group of people or it was one person, but apparently it was somebody or some people that were credible in the eyes of the master. Because the master calls the manager in. And if you read between the lines, as we get into the story a little bit more, it seems like the manager had been doing this for quite some time with this master's money. And he calls him in and he says, give an account. What are you doing? with my money? And of course, the manager goes into panic mode. Because the master tells him, he says, you've done such a bad job, guess what? You're no longer going to be my manager. And that really sends the manager over the top. He goes into that panic mode and he says, what am I going to do? You know, I'm too old. You know, what am I going to do? I'm too old to go out and do manual labor. And I'm too proud to go to the street and beg. And so you can just see the panic and the worry that's taking place in this manager. So let's see what he does. We'll pick it up in verse 5. The manager goes to the debtors, and he asks the first one, how much do you owe, my master? 900 gallons of oil, he replied. The manager told him, well, take that bill, scratch it out, and put 450. And he goes to the second one, and he says, tell me, how much do you owe my master? And he says, 1,000 bushels of wheat. And he says, well, scratch that out and make it 800. Now, the thing you've got to keep in mind about managers, they were much like tax collectors during that time. Remember, tax collectors always charged the people more than what the Roman government actually said they should be taxed, because that was their way of getting rich. Well, the manager probably did something very similar. They probably tacked on interest, and they kept the interest. And so these people, if you've ever been in debt and you're trying to pay off a debt, you know that if you don't get on top, if you just pay the minimum, the interest just eats you up. But if you get on top of it and pay extra, you can reduce that amount down. Well, apparently back during this time, a lot of these managers would elevate it up. And so as a result, they were making money in kind of a shrewd way. And so here's this manager now. And he goes to the debtors and he says, well, guess what? I want you to slash it down. You know, take your paper and say, no longer do you owe 900 gallons of oil, you owe 450. And oh, by the way, you no longer owe $1,000 or 1,000 bushels. You now only owe 800. And he did that thinking, well, maybe if I do that, maybe I'll have a place where I can go when my manager puts me out. Because the amount that he had them take off was probably the amount he had already inflated what they owed the master. The response of the master we find in beginning of verse 8. It says, the master committed the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. He acted shrewdly. You see, doesn't mean the master let the manager retain his position, not at all. And doesn't mean that the master condoned what the manager had done in the mismanagement of his wealth. But when he said he acted shrewdly, what it means is he acted wisely to try to find some place to go in the event when it came time for the master to put him out. And then continuing on in verse 8 and 9, we find Jesus commenting now about the manager especially. He says, for the people of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself. He says, Jesus looks at his disciples out there, and he looks out at the Jewish leaders, and he says, you know what? And some translations call it the sons of the world and sons of light. But he says, you know what? They're more shrewd in dealing with financial things than the people of God. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying, if you look at people of the world, when they look at finances, what do they look at? They look at being, especially you have someone that's very wealthy, that's in the world, they have a tendency to look at and say, oh, look what I've amassed. Look at what I've earned. Look at what I have. And they look at it as a status symbol to elevate themselves up. And not only as a status symbol, oftentimes they use it as a leverage to try to get what they want. If you've ever been around politicians, I promise you, if you watch politicians, the ones they will coddle up to are their largest donors. And their largest donors are the ones that when they talk to that politician, they expect that politician to jump because they gave that money. And that's what Jesus is talking about when you've got people of the world. They look at money as a way to elevate themselves, as a way to be a status symbol, as a way to say, I'm better than someone out there that doesn't have the same amount of wealth as I've got. And then he contrasts that with the people of the light, or sons of the light. He says, the sons of the light view wealth as a blessing from God. A blessing from God to use for His honor and glory. And so in the eyes of the world, the fact that you would take your money and you would use it for the glory of the kingdom seems very foolish. The fact that you would give money to promote the gospel would seem very foolish to people in the world. But what Jesus is saying is that's what's important. And then he goes on to say, he says, make friends for yourself by unrighteous mammon so that you may receive into the eternal habitation. Jesus is not talking about what the manager did, looking for a place to stay. He's talking about when you make friends with money, you look at your wealth as a blessing from God and as a way to give glory and honor to God. And so you manage your money so that you seek first His kingdom. That's how you make friends with unrighteous mammon. And that's how you get into eternal habitation. Jesus isn't condemning wealth. What Jesus is condemning is the love of money. Jesus never condemns money by itself. If you look at passages, Jesus doesn't say money is the root of all evil. He says the love of money is the root of all evil. And so what Jesus is saying is you must learn to use this wealth that is so easy to get ourselves wrapped around and get so easy to get so involved in, to the point that we think we've got to have more and more and more. But Jesus is saying, no, God has blessed you, and He asks that you give Him of the first fruits. to His honor and His glory. And then he goes on in verses 10 through 12 to again expand on the sin of the manager. He says, if one is unfaithful in little things, if one is faithful in little things, they will be faithful in bigger things. If one is dishonest in little things, also they will be dishonest with much. And you see, that's where the manager was. It was a little thing to manage this money and do it right, and he didn't do it. And what Jesus is saying to his disciples is saying, if you can make friends with mammon to the point where you can use it to honor and glorify God, that's a little thing. And then you can be trusted with the real rich things. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19 and 20, he said, don't lay up for yourself treasures here on earth where moth and vermin come in and destroy. And then in verse 20 he says, but lay up yourself treasures in heaven where moths and vermin can't destroy. You see, when Jesus looked at wealth, he knew as human beings, when we looked at wealth, we had a tendency to be selfish with it. We have a tendency to say, look at what I've done, especially in our society. How much do we teach our children? Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Get all you can earn. Be all you can be. Be the best. And so people think, well, if I'm going to be the best, I got to have the best. You know, if I've got one car, I got to have two cars. If I have two cars, I have three cars. If my neighbor's got two cars on a boat, I've got to have two cars on a yacht. I've got to outdo them. And we get so caught up in thinking in terms of wealth. We get so caught up in thinking in terms of, okay, I've got this much. Now, how do I keep it? How do I keep people from taking it from me? How do I even get more? And so we get wrapped up in this cycle that says, I want more and more and more. And so Jesus, he caps it off by saying, no one can serve two masters. You'll either love one and hate the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. And when he talks about masters there, he's talking about mammon. He's talking about money as the second master. You see, when money becomes our focus, and that becomes our drive for what we do, then money becomes our God. It becomes our master. And when it becomes our master, then we have put God to the side. When we look at this parable, and you get to the end, it's so ironic. In Luke chapter 6 and verses 14 and 15. Look at the Pharisees. I mean, Jesus has just shot them right between the head, and it's just gone right over their head. The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, you are the ones who justify yourself in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. See, Jesus didn't cut any corners with the Pharisees. He said, you got a heart problem. Because you think, you esteem money so highly, you think that it makes you something in the eyes of those around you. And what Jesus says, you don't understand. God sees that as detestable. Because what you're doing is, when you focus, Pharisees, upon making money and loving money, you're saying, I don't need God. I have my God, my money. You know, when we look at this parable and apply it to ourselves, how easy it is for us to fall into that same trap as the Pharisees. How easy is it for us to look at things, especially in our society where we have such freedom to do and go about and be. How easy it is to be caught up in that trap and thinking, oh, look at what I've made, instead of looking what God has blessed me with. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, the scripture reading that Keith read for us this morning, talked about the birds and the fields and how, you know, they didn't worry about anything because God took care of them. And he says, if God will take care of the birds and the grass, which is here today and gone tomorrow, meaning it dies, how much more will he take care of you? How much more valuable are you than these? And what Jesus says is, trust me. Trust me. And the way we trust him, as he said there, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, knowing that anything that we're going to need, not necessarily want, but anything we're going to need in this world to help us survive will be given to us by God if we just trust him. If we just turn loose and say, okay, God, I will seek you first. I will seek your kingdom first. I will seek your righteousness first. And I will trust that you will provide for me. That's a whole different perspective than what the world has. Because what the world would say is, if you don't do it for yourself, it won't get done. And so, as a result, things keep churning and churning and churning until one day we all die. And as I said, you can't take it with you, and you can't. And when that day comes, are we going to die knowing that we trusted in God to provide, or are we going to die thinking, look at what I have accomplished, look at what I have done? And so when Jesus talks about wealth here and in other passages, he knows the temptation that wealth can be and how it can take a person and destroy a person on the inside and destroy a person's faith. But if God has given you the ability to make money and has blessed you with that ability, he says, use that ability to his honor and glory. Paul admonished Timothy when he was there in Ephesus. He said, admonish those who are rich to be liberal in good deeds, so that they can take hold of the life that is really life. See, Paul understood life is not about all the money that they had, but life was about giving. Life was about honoring God. And I have, over the years, especially the time that Julie and I spent in Abilene, I saw some people that were Christians that were quite liberal. And then I saw some Christians that were the total opposite. That looked at their money and said, it's my money. You need to bow down to me and do what I ask. My wife experienced that a whole lot. She worked out to the private airport called Abilene Aero at the time, and there would be people that would come in that were the most compassionate, loving people, Christians, and then there were people that had the name Christian that didn't act like it. They thought, well, I've got this money, I'm paying you, you need to do this and make this happen right now. You see, what God says, it's mine. I've given it to you to use for my honor and glory and for a blessing to you. And the true blessing comes by finding the life that is life, like Paul talked about in 1 Timothy. That is, in being a compassionate, kind-hearted person that reaches out and does what they can to help others come to Christ and also help take care of their physical needs. That's what Jesus was trying to get across in this parable. And also, if you look at the last parable in Luke chapter 16, you will find that's what Jesus was trying to get across. It's not about what you do, it's about letting me do through you. If I bless you, let me show you how you can use that wealth to honor and glorify me and to help others. And that's what it's all about. And that's why Jesus hammered home so much about wealth, because he knew if there was anything that would keep a person from being a true disciple, it would be the fact that they thought, I don't need this because I've got everything I need in the world on my own. And Jesus looks at that and says, with pity, so many times saying, how hard it is for those who are rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Because he understood that if you didn't get a handle on using your wealth to honor and glorify him, it will keep you from entering the kingdom of heaven. Because wealth can make us very selfish, or it can make us very generous. The choice is, who are we going to follow? Who are we going to trust? Who are we going to seek? If we seek his kingdom and his righteousness, then we'll be generous. If we don't, we'll be selfish. This morning you may be here and you may have not yet made your initial commitment to Jesus. We'd love to help you find your way towards that. Or maybe you're here and you've had a relationship with Jesus and you've wandered from it. Again, we'd love to talk with you. We'd love to pray with you. We'd love to help you in any way that we can. And so we would encourage you to make that known.